Thank you everyone for joining today's virtual public hearing. My name is Ashley Armand, Deputy Director for Community Engagement at the MBTA, and I'm the moderator for tonight's hearing. We appreciate you joining us tonight. Tonight's hearing is to share information and receive feedback on the MBTA's 2024 updates to the service delivery policy. Dan Zagarnik, our Acting Chief of Operations, Planning, Scheduling, and Strategy, will be giving a presentation alongside Lee Birnbaum, our Manager of Performance and Reporting. We ask that you please hold all comments until the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few meeting controls for folks who are not familiar with Zoom. Can we begin sharing the slides, please?
Ashley, can you see the slides?
I can,
We are able to see the slides. You are
okay.
on the slide 1 right now.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. I cannot do the slides. Next slide, please. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Next slide. Okay, we will also offer interpretation during this meeting. In your meeting webinar controls, you can click on interpretation, that's the small globe icon, and click on the language that you would like to hear. Tonight's meeting will have interpretation in Chinese. Next slide, please. We'd also like to let you know about our diversity and civil rights. All MBTA activities, including public meetings, are free of discrimination. The MBTA complies with all federal and state civil rights requirements preventing discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, limited English proficiency, and additional protected characteristics. We welcome the diversity from across our entire service area. If you have any questions or concerns, we ask that you follow this website to reach out to the Office of Diversity and Civil Rights. Next slide, please. Again, we'd like to thank you so much for joining this meeting. I'd now like to hand this off to Dan Zagarnik.
You can go to the next slide. Great. So I'm going to introduce what is the service delivery policy, something that I am very excited about. So the service delivery policy does two things. It sets the MBTA service quality standards. And the second thing that it does is defines how service delivery is measured against those standards. This uh, the service objects of the service delivery policy are broadly concerns with quantity of service provided. Other MBTA objectives like safety and customer satisfaction are not traditionally part of the service delivery policy remit. And so you could see the service objective on the right hand side. We define that service availability, span of service, frequency of service, and coverage. Accessibility, which is station access and stop accessibility, ferry and dock accessibility, elevator uptime, platform accessibility, and vehicle accessibility, as well as reliability, which is system reliability and service operated, and then comfort and crowding, which is vehicle crowding, and then there's paratransit has its own set of standards. So OPMI, which is which is a shared service between MassDOT and MBTA, it's a department that stands for Lee, you want to help me out here?
The Office of Performance Management and Innovation.
Great. Office of Performance Management and Innovation. It produces annual and public-facing reports evaluating service quality performance for the previous fall. So this is a public-facing document that people have access to. So the policy is revised periodically. So these service quality standards and how we are measuring against those standards were last updated in 2021. And so this revision includes minor, maybe some moderate changes in both form and substance. And this is what we are here to talk to you about and walk you through those details and hear your comments. So there's stricter standards for measuring heavy rail and bus reliability and some new accessibility measures. The policy edits concern how the MBTA defines optimal service levels. This is not a proposal to make service changes. I think we can go to the next slide. So this is a official and formal process that we are executing right now. So on October 24th, we previewed these policy changes with the MBTA Board of Directors. And so today is the public hearing, and it begins a 21-day public comment period. So if you are heard something today but didn't think of the comment until after the meeting, and you will say, "Oh, I wish I had said something," you still have an opportunity to submit a comment using an email using the address provided below, which is publicengagement@mbta.com. The MBTA will submit and amend the policy to the MBTA Board of Directors for final approval to adopt changes in late December. And if you want see details, we do have a website that has the service delivery policy and all the information available online. You can see the link down below. Next slide, please. So we did wanted to spend most of the time talking about the more substantial changes that fall, and so I think that's a more pertinent conversation. So we're going to talk about reliability, accessibility, and comfort and crowding. And so the most significant changes are really for heavy rail. We are no longer going to be using the old standard, which is on time performance, also known as OTP, and we're moving it to proposing to move to excess trip time, which we believe is a much more customer oriented and passenger experience oriented metric. And Lee will definitely get into all the details as to why we believe it's a better way to measure ourselves. And so for bus, we're increasing the standard to penalize drop trips, and we'll explain why we are now able to do that. It's something that we were unable to do in years past. And then finally, the platform accessibility. We're changing how elevator closures are evaluated again to better reflect the customer experience. You go to the next slide. And this is just a spacer slide of the exact same thing I just said, but I will hand it off to Lee to talk about the details of the very specific things that I just mentioned, starting with excess trip time.
Thank you, Dan. You can move on to the next slide. So one of the main portions of the SDP of interest, I think, to writers and to us as an agency is measuring how reliable the service the T is providing. This obviously is something that has been top of mind for a lot of people over these last couple of years. And we want to be sure that we are measuring that in a way that provides useful information to writers and also so that we can make improvements over time. Next slide. The single biggest change, as Dan mentioned, is going to be for our heavy rail lines, moving from our existing on-time performance metric, which I'll discuss very briefly, to a new metric. So to give a little bit of background about the existing metric, because on-time performance certainly sounds like a metric that we would be concerned with, and some of the deficiencies that metric has. So that metric measures our time of the trip against the schedule. And for our infrequent services, that's scheduled departure time. And for our frequent services, which is the heavy rail, on scheduled headway, and only on our ability to match the schedule. It's only calculated on operated trips. So if there's ever a trip dropped on-time performance as it has currently been implemented does not in any way count that, much less penalize it. It measures the time that people wait for a vehicle, but does not measure the travel time. So if speeds are reduced due to things like speed restrictions, it doesn't appear in the on-time performance metric. The other thing that the current metric does is it smooths out results over 30-minute periods for frequent service and basically says how has the service performed over a 30-minute period on average. As you can imagine, it then leaves a few things unstated. And you can see on the right side of this slide what that on-time performance metric has looked like over the last few years. You can see the two major incidents where the FTA came in and provided some requirements that changed our service. And then also when the speed improvement program started, again, excuse me, the speed restrictions, were implemented. And you can see that the on-time performance metric changed very little in the presence of all of those situations because we adjusted schedules to reflect those changes and then did a reasonable job of matching those schedules. If you move to the next slide, you can see our excess trip time metric. This metric includes all of the portions of a trip. It measures all of them against a benchmark. So if you look at the bottom portion of that slide, you see that we have a benchmark trip time, which is made up of the time that we expect that one should wait for a vehicle if there is good service, and the amount of time it would take to travel to your destination, including the time spent waiting at stations along the way for people to board and exit. And we compare that to the actual trip time for that trip, which again is the actual wait time, which could be more, less, or the same as the benchmark. The actual travel time, which again includes the dwell time, which is the period at stations along the way. And we compare those two. The difference between those two is the excess trip time. This then includes all of the pieces of the journey, which means that if there are dropped trips, the waits are longer, which appears in the metric. If the headways are uneven, for example, if one train is 2 minutes apart and the next one is 12 minutes after, then that uneven headway increases the wait time, which appears in there. And if anything causes the travel time or the dwell time, such as speed restrictions or problems with doors or anything like that, those are included in this metric as well. If you move to the next slide, you can then see how this has an impact on what we measure. This slide here shows the red line over the last few years using the existing on-time performance metric, which is similar to what we saw a couple slides back, and also compares it with how excess trip time calculates that same period. You can see the dramatic impact of the events that we highlighted here, such as the FTA service reductions and the speed restrictions introduced. And you can also see the impact of the track improvement program as those speed restrictions have begun to come off. Unlike the existing metric, you can see that in early 2023, we were delivering service that was only meeting the expected travel time about 15% of the time. As a daily writer of the system, this definitely feels a lot closer to what we experienced over this period of time than the old metric does. If you move to the next slide, you can see this for the orange line, which had a bit more in the way of ups and downs, but a similar trend. And then also on the next slide, again, for the blue line, which had fewer issues to address, and we were able to return to something closer to full service much more quickly. If you move again to the next slide, this was where we get to the, apologies, if you go back a slide. So this is excess trip time. This is something that we are very excited about. It has been many years in the making both in terms of making sure that we are measuring the correct things and ensuring that we have all of the data available to compute this correctly and completely. So we are now ready to start using it, and hopefully, pending comments in the board, ready to begin pushing this out as our new metric of reliability for heavy rail. If you move on to the next slide, we'll discuss changes for bus and Green Line. So despite what I said about all of the problems with the on-time performance metric, we will still be using it for bus and Green Line for the time being because we do not yet have all of the data available in order to compute excess trip time for these modes. We are excited to do the work to get to a point where we can compute it for bus and Green Line, but we do want to improve the accuracy of the metric that we have for those modes while we continue to work on the data in the background. So on bus, the big change that we're making is that we are now penalizing when a trip is dropped in the on-time performance calculation. Previously, we had been excluding that trip from our calculation because we did not have the data to differentiate between a bus that was not running and a bus that was not reporting its location and time, which could mean that the bus was there, but that we were not getting the data off of it. A lot of work has been happening over the last few years to improve that data feed. And now we believe that we are confidently able to differentiate between those situations and properly to reflect the hit on on-time performance that a dropped trip would bring. On the Green Line, the change that we're making is very small. Right now, in the trunk, which is to say the tunnel of underground stops along the middle of the Green Line from Kenmore out through Leechmere, we have assumed that headways are 3 minutes in between trains all day, every day, and use that as the goal for on-time performance. During the peak of the day, most days, and even much of the off-peak, that is close enough to accurate. I apologize, somebody has put a question in here about the interpretation, and I believe that the public engagement team probably is best to address that. I can pause, though, on the content. And I see now that it has been fixed. Was there anything that would be good for me to go back and cover because people using translation would not have heard it or would not have seen it? Okay, thank you. So on the Green Line, my apologies to reset here. We had been assuming 3-minute headways in the trunk. There were some times of the day in the week in which the actual schedule was greater than 3 minutes between trains along this portion. In those scenarios, we now are using the scheduled headway as our measure of what is appropriate to see between trains to better reflect the actual experience of riders. The obviously cannot deliver service that is better than the schedule in that type of scenario. So again, a very small change. If we move on to the next slide, you can actually see the impacts of these changes. So looking back at performance in fall 2023, so that is now the service that was run a year ago and is the subject of the most recent public-facing report on the service delivery policy. You can see in the first blue column what the results we reported were using the 2021 policy. And in the green column to the right, you can see the results using the new policy. And what you can see then is that when we penalize dropped trips, the overall reliability of the bus network is a bit lower than it had been when we were ignoring those trips. And you can see that that varies a little bit over the course of the week, and can also add some extra color that frequent routes definitely see more of a drop because those trips are more often dropped when there is a need to skip a particular trip. If you move on to the next slide, you'll see the green line reliability, where the changes are also quite small because we are, in this case, making the metrics slightly more forgiving, which is to say, to match the actual schedule. You see the numbers go up a bit between those on the weekday and Saturday. But these really are only on the margins. That is the list of major changes for reliability. If you move forward one slide and then maybe a couple of seconds later while I sip my tea to the next slide, we'll now talk about the changes in accessibility. You can move on to the next slide, please. Accessibility obviously is important to the MBTA and to its riders, as people of all abilities need to be able to access MBTA services. And our existing SDP, service delivery policy measures do not currently cover all modes, and we are working towards adding those that are missing. Next slide. So we are adding new measures. We are adding a measure of bus stop accessibility. We're adding ferry dock accessibility, and we're adding ferry boat accessibility. On the ferry, just to clarify, the docks would be equivalent to thinking of whether the station is accessible or not, and the boats are the vehicle. So you need both to be accessible for a trip to be fully accessible. Next slide. This contains the definitions of what accessibility is for each of these. Most of these definitions come from existing documents, policies, regulations, or other legal documents, and are probably best referenced inside the document for somebody who wants to dig into all of the details. But broadly speaking, a bus stop needs a landing area for the ramp, a path to the nearest street crossing, and no other major barriers. There is an asterisk here that the bus stop inventory does not contain all characteristics for all stops, and the policy indicates that we will use the best available data in each year as more of those data are added to the database. On the ferry side, the dock is accessible if there is not excessive slope due to changing tide, and that an accessible transition on or off a vessel is available via a bridge plate or a gangway level to the vessel. Within a ferry, it is accessible if the entryways exceed the width requirements of the various bodies that regulate this information. It also must have an accessible restroom, and the audio-visual system must also have accessible features to it so that announcements are available. Next slide, we can look at the results on the ferry docks, on the ferry information, again from fall of 2023. And we can see that the total number of docks that were accessible was a bit over 56%. We also weight almost all of our metrics by ridership, which is to say we count more the stations or trips or whatever it is that we're measuring when more people use it. And you can see that the weighted dock accessibility is only a bit over 30%, which means that some of the highest ridership docks are presently inaccessible. On the bus stops, we don't have data to share yet. That data collection process is happening now, and we look forward to using that in upcoming reports with the service delivery policy, as well as for the ferries themselves, where also data collection is in process. If you move on to the next slide, we then have our change to platform accessibility. This refers to our rail stations. Right now, a platform is considered accessible if the elevators to the platform are available, or if the elevator is out of service, if we provide an accessible shuttle to that station so that somebody can access a platform at another station. That is a subpar experience for people who need an elevator to access the train. And so we are moving to a situation where now, anytime where there is a required transfer using a shuttle to another station will be counted as inaccessible rather than accessible as before. There is one exception to that, which is that when the elevator is closed due to an accessibility project, such as replacing that elevator, we then exclude from the calculation. So we are not counting those hours as accessible, but we have removed it from the period overall. This language matches what is in the Daniels-Feingold settlement, which has established a lot of the requirements for accessibility at stations and governs a lot of the plans for accessibility across the MBTA. The next slide shows you the impact on the results for our platform accessibility standard. Because we had some elevator outages during the year, the overall accessibility of our platforms decreases using this new metric from just over 99% to about 97.5%, because those hours are no longer being counted as accessible and thus better reflect the rider experience in that scenario. That is the end of our accessibility section. The next slide will take us to our brief final area of major change, which is on passenger comfort. You can skip forward. Next slide, please. And one more. So we would like to measure passenger comfort. And in doing so, what we do is measure how much crowding there is on board a vehicle. And we set a maximum load that is on a vehicle for us to consider it to be a comfortable ride. We have been doing this historically for bus, but we can now add this for heavy rail, which is to say the red, orange, and blue lines. You move to the next slide. Basically, as stated here, that we did not have a metric before. We do now have the ability to approximate the amount of people on board each vehicle based on information from fare gates and other sensors. It is approximate in terms of we cannot guarantee that somebody who entered a station boarded the next vehicle, but we can assume that is generally the case, given the time to walk from the entryway to the platform. And we don't yet have information about which car each person is in. We assume sort of even boarding across the cars, which over the course of a full run is a reasonable enough assumption. If you go to the next slide, you'll see our initial estimate of this for fall 2023, where on heavy rail, 98.9% of the time, we were able to offer service with enough space per passenger. And that definition you can see on the slide here on the right, that off-peak time is assuming 10 square feet per standing passenger. And at peak, we allow for there to be more crowding, and that is 3 square feet per standing passenger. Those are the major changes. The next slide contains a list of minor changes that are in the service delivery policy update. Most of these are about the formatting or bringing things up to date with other changes across the system. So, for example, there's a new executive summary. There was a glossary initially that now has been replaced with definitions where the words occur. Some of the sections have been reordered in order to improve the readability of the document. We have updated terms to reflect changes in how the MBTA is describing its service. So, for example, key bus routes, which are being renamed as frequent routes, are referred to this way inside the document. Regional rail is now being called, commuter rail is now being called regional rail, and what we formerly called community bus routes are now called coverage bus routes. Again, no changes to the proposed service associated with any of that, but matching the titles in the policy to the wording being used elsewhere in communications. For descriptions of routes and fleets, we have updated the listing, particularly for anywhere where we have new vehicles, where we need more information to describe how many people can fit inside the vehicle at a high or low crowding situation. And also, again, to update which bus routes are categorized as frequent coverage or any other appropriate category based on any changes to the service that's provided over the last few years. Similarly, there's a diversion service standard which was adopted last year that is now embedded in this policy without any change to that standard, just putting it into this document. And then there were a few metrics related to customer service, but not the actual delivery of the transportation services on paratransit that were removed from the policy because they don't reflect service delivery issues. They are still going to be reported by the MBTA. There's still important metrics about things like call center wait times, but they're not about the transportation services being delivered. That is the final slide of prepared material. I believe we are now open for questions, but I will turn it back over to Dan and the public engagement team to run the show on that. But I'm here to assist if anything comes up that I can help with.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Lee. After learning about this policy, we'd love to hear from all of you. If you'd like to share a comment or ask a question, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your typed question or comment. You can also use the raise hand feature as well. We'll be alternating between reading questions and comments already submitted and recognizing those who'd like to pose a question verbally. We just ask that you're brief so that we can hear from as many people as possible. For those who wish to share a question or comment verbally, and you're joining by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing the star and then the 9 button. And all attendees who speak any other languages, you can raise your hand to provide your comment and question for our interpreter to hear, and then we'll repeat your comment or question aloud. When we recognize your name, you'll be unmuted and you may speak. And after you share your comment, we'll lower your hand and you will then be returned to a muted state. Before we open the question and comment segment up to the public, we'd like to invite any elected officials in attendance or their staff to ask questions or make comments. You can use the raise hand feature so we can recognize and unmute you. Okay, going once, twice. Okay, we're now opening up to the public. I'll check the chat right now to see if there are any questions or comments in the chat, or if anybody has any questions or comments to raise verbally. Opening up the space for that now. Okay. Well, if anyone has any questions or comments post this meeting, you can email us at publicengagement@mbta.com. I'll also place it here in the chat for you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and feel free to reach out to us anytime if any questions arise. Thank you. Have a good evening, and thank you again for joining us.